I'm a 30-year-old woman, and Thanksgiving in my family has always been, let's just say, a production. Every year, it's the same. We gather at my parents' house, stuffed into a too-small dining room, and we go through the motions. Smiles are forced, old grudges get rehashed, and the atmosphere teeters on the edge of a blowout from the moment I walk through the door. But this year, I decided it was going to be different. I'd been working on myself, setting boundaries, and trying to let go of the feeling that I had to fix everything for everyone. Thanksgiving, though, felt like my last test. My family didn't exactly make things easy, and I had a feeling this year wouldn't be any exception. Still, I walked in, hoping for peace, armed with my best intentions. The moment I stepped inside, I could feel the tension. It was barely noon, and already, everyone seemed on edge. My mom was in the kitchen, barking orders as she pulled a turkey out of the oven. The smell of burned stuffing hit me like a wall, and the noise of clanging dishes and clinking glasses was intense. Mom gave me a quick hug, then whispered in that way only moms can, "Please, just try to get along with everyone today. It's Thanksgiving. It would be nice if you could. Fall in line, for once." Her words didn't surprise me. She'd always tried to keep up appearances, no matter what was boiling under the surface. As soon as I walked into the living room, Aunt Linda cornered me. She does this every year, and every year I brace myself. She started in immediately, asking me if I was still at that same job. Apparently, it's still hard for her to understand why I'd waste my education on a career that doesn't match her idea of success. Then there was Uncle Rick, who barely looked up from his phone as he pointed out, in his usual blunt way, that I'd gained a bit. Not even a hello, just that. I let it slide, though I could feel the knot in my stomach growing. Before I could catch my breath, my sister Jessica was there, smiling that too-sweet smile that always means trouble. Jessica, who has 2 kids, immediately asked, "So, still single?" The room went quiet, and I felt every set of eyes on me. She followed up with, "Oh, and no kids, right?" It was her classic line, her way of reminding everyone who the real adult was. I gave her a tight smile, trying not to react. Somewhere between the appetizers and setting the table, my dad pulled me aside. He started with small talk, asking how work was going, but it quickly shifted. My brother, of course, had gotten into some financial trouble. Again, Dad said, family helps family. Maybe you could chip in a little? Just until he gets back on his feet. I wanted to ask when, exactly, my brother had ever been on his feet, but I bit my tongue. The room was buzzing with conversation, but I felt like every word was a direct hit. As we finally sat down for dinner, my mom noticed I wasn't piling on the mashed potatoes. She looked disappointed, even a little insulted. Despite knowing for years that I have specific dietary restrictions, she said, "Oh, come on, just a little. We all have to eat the same. It's family." Before I could protest, she loaded my plate with everything I'd hoped to avoid. The tension rose as dinner went on. My cousin, who had just gotten engaged, spent most of the meal flashing her ring and dropping not-so-subtle hints about my single lifestyle. Each remark felt like a punch, and everyone seemed to be waiting for me to react, but I didn't give them the satisfaction. Then, as if on cue, my mom started to tear up, making a little speech about how Thanksgiving used to mean so much more to us. "It hurts me to see my kids not getting along," she said, dabbing her eyes. And that's when it started. The old grudges, the usual arguments from past Thanksgivings that we all thought we'd buried. Suddenly, everyone was blaming me for things that happened years ago, dragging up memories I'd rather forget. Even if I tried to defend myself, it wouldn't have mattered. They'd all made up their minds about my sins ages ago. Just when I thought I couldn't take anymore, my younger cousin, who had stayed out of the chaos all evening, leaned over and whispered, "Hey, don't let them get to you. I see what's going on." It was a small gesture, but in that moment it meant everything. But it wasn't enough to hold back the rising frustration. The final straw was when they all started mocking my obsession with work-life balance. I'd worked hard to get to a point where I felt proud of my career, and hearing them laugh about it made me feel like I was suffocating. I'd come in hoping for a peaceful evening, but I could feel myself unraveling under their relentless digs. So I did something I'd never done before. I stood up, grabbed my coat, and headed for the door. No big speech, no explanations, just a silent exit. I could feel their eyes on me, the surprise and confusion as I walked out. The messages started before I'd even made it to my car, one after another lighting up my phone. They were shocked, calling me selfish, demanding to know why I would ruin Thanksgiving. But as I pulled away, I didn't feel selfish. I just felt free. Update 1. The fallout started almost immediately. As soon as I drove away from my parents' house, my phone began buzzing nonstop. By the time I got home, I had over a dozen missed calls, texts, and voicemails. Each one was a different family member, each with their own opinion about what I'd done. First, there was my mom's voicemail, tearful and dramatic, as usual. Her voice wavered, asking me how I could just walk out on my family like that. She talked about how much effort she put into making Thanksgiving special for everyone, and how it was heartbreaking to see me leave. Every word was loaded, meant to make me feel guilty, and I could almost see her sitting there, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue for effect. Then came the texts from my brother. He'd always had a short fuse, so his messages were angrier, calling me selfish and immature for causing a scene. According to him, I'd acted like I was too good for the family, and he was quick to remind me that real family doesn't just walk out. I scrolled through his texts, one after the other, all variations on the same theme. He clearly didn't want to hear my side of the story, just wanted to make sure I knew how wrong I was. The calls from my dad came next, one missed call after another. Finally, he left a long text. It was half apology, half guilt trip. He said he was sorry if things got a little out of hand, but reminded me that family holidays can be stressful, and sometimes people say things they don't mean. He ended with a plea to keep the peace and told me that family is all we have in the end. I wasn't sure what to make of his message. It felt like he was on the verge of taking my side, but then he'd pull back, falling back into the family unity line. As I tried to process all the messages, my Aunt Linda chimed in with a text of her own. She went on about how Thanksgiving is a time for family and how I had ruined it for everyone by leaving. She made sure to add that my mother was devastated and that I should call to apologize. Aunt Linda was always like this, quick to jump in, even when it wasn't her place. Then there was my sister, Jessica. Strangely enough, she didn't say anything. No text, no call, nothing. It was a rare moment of silence from her, and in a way, it was almost worse than the barrage of messages from everyone else. Jessica had always been the queen of passive aggressiveness, and this felt like her own way of punishing me, by giving me the silent treatment. I knew I couldn't take it all at once, so I decided to take a step back. I blocked my mom's number temporarily, as well as my brother's, just to get a little peace. The constant messages were exhausting, and I needed a break from the guilt tripping. I left a few contacts open, like my dad and my cousin, who'd been supportive during Thanksgiving. I didn't want to block everyone entirely, just enough to breathe. The next day, my friends came over. I told them what happened, and they were there to lend a hand, surprised but proud that I'd finally set boundaries. They knew how difficult my family could be, and were happy to see me putting myself first for a change. We spent the day talking, laughing, and distracting me from the chaos of it all, and for a few hours I could forget about the family drama. In the evening, though, my dad texted again. This time, it was different, shorter, more blunt. He called me dramatic for blocking family members and warned me that I'd regret burning bridges. It was clear his apology from the night before had vanished, replaced by frustration. I could almost picture him pacing around, trying to find the right words to convince me to back down. As the messages kept rolling in, I felt a pang of guilt when my cousin reached out, the only family member who hadn't tried to guilt trip me. He said he was sorry for what had happened, and that he understood why I'd left. It was a short message, but it left me feeling a bit torn, like I'd somehow let him down by leaving. Still, I knew deep down that it wasn't my job to stick around and endure the family's treatment just to spare his feelings. I decided to bring it up with my therapist, who had heard me talk about my family for years. She listened to everything that had happened and encouraged me to stand firm in my boundaries. She reminded me that I had the right to distance myself from toxic dynamics, even if that meant facing the backlash. It wasn't easy to hear, but it was the reminder I needed to keep going. Over the next few days, the resentment started to build. The more I reread their messages, the clearer it became that my family was refusing to see my side. Everything was twisted into how I'd abandoned them, and no one seemed to care about why I felt the need to walk out in the first place. It all came to a head when I received a particularly nasty text from my mom. She'd sent a long list of everything she thought I'd done wrong over the years, each point designed to make me feel like the problem. That was it. I blocked her number, too, along with my dad's. I knew they'd keep reaching out, but I'd had enough. The silence was both strange and freeing. I went no contact for the first time in my life, spending the next few weeks focusing on myself. My phone was quieter than it had ever been, and the absence of constant family demands was a relief. For once, I could breathe. Before long, I realized I had my own ultimatum to stick to. I'd only open the door to them again if they could acknowledge and respect my boundaries. Until then, the door was firmly closed. Update 2. About a week after the Thanksgiving fallout, an email arrived in my inbox with the subject line, Family Discussion. It was from my parents, and they'd CT pretty much everyone. The whole family list. In the email, my mom went on about how Thanksgiving had gone off the rails, and while no one was completely innocent, it was clear she was hinting that my walking out had been the catalyst. She wrote that they wanted to have a family discussion to smooth things over, adding a few lines about how everyone had learned a lot from this and wanted to make changes. They promised that, if I agreed to meet, everyone would be better and try to respect my boundaries. It felt a little too scripted, like she'd read a book on conflict resolution, and was now trying to play the part. My first instinct was to ignore it, but I hesitated. They'd already started throwing around promises of change, and I was curious, even if skeptical. I replied, saying I'd be open to meeting on the condition that we met somewhere neutral, not their house, not mine. I chose a small cafe in town where I knew they'd feel out of place enough to avoid causing a scene. After a few back and forths, they reluctantly agreed, even if they clearly weren't thrilled about the location. On the day of the meeting, I arrived first, choosing a booth in the back corner. When they walked in, I could tell right away they were uncomfortable. My parents looked around, shifting in place as they took in the casual setup. My mom shot me a tight smile, and they slid into the booth opposite me, my brother and sister filling in beside them. The air felt thick with tension, and no one seemed eager to start. My mom cleared her throat and launched into a carefully rehearsed apology. Her voice was soft, and she kept dabbing her eyes as she spoke, saying things like it was never my intention to hurt you and I just want us to be close again. The apology felt shallow, though. It was all about how she felt, how she missed me. There was no acknowledgement of the pressure they'd put on me, or of the way they'd crossed lines. I nodded along, waiting to see if she'd address any of the real issues. She didn't. My dad, on the other hand, looked at me and sighed, saying that maybe they could try to be more understanding if it meant keeping the family together. His tone was begrudging, and it was obvious he didn't fully believe his own words. Still, it was something, and I kept my face neutral, waiting to see what else they had to offer. Then my sister Jessica chimed in, her voice dripping with that same passive aggressiveness I'd come to expect. She said that, while she understood my desire for space, I needed to be more flexible if we were ever going to move forward. Flexible, as in go back to the same dynamic where I stayed silent and let everyone else walk all over me. I kept my mouth shut, letting her finish, but I could feel the frustration building. Just as I thought they might at least try to meet me halfway, my brother spoke up. He shrugged, saying that the entire situation had been blown out of proportion and that I was too sensitive about everything. According to him, I'd overreacted, and all this fuss was unnecessary drama. His words landed like a slap. They were practically gaslighting me, shifting blame onto me as if I'd made it all up. At that point, I knew I had to be direct. I told them I wasn't interested in more apologies or flexibility if it just meant going back to the same toxic patterns. If they really wanted me around, they'd need to respect my boundaries and stop dismissing my feelings. They exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable. My dad nodded, reluctantly agreeing to try, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't fully on board. Their agreement came with a side of jabs. They'd nod and say they understood, only to add little comments about how family should be willing to compromise and how we all have flaws. It was all just passive-aggressive enough to let me know nothing had really changed. After one final dig from my sister about how hard it is to always walk on eggshells around me, I felt that same frustration rising all over again. They wanted me back on their terms, not because they actually respected the boundaries I'd set. Without another word, I picked up my bag and stood up, ready to leave once more. As I walked out, I could hear my mom's voice rising behind me, pleading, but I didn't turn back. I'd given them their chance, and it was clear they weren't willing to truly change. After that meeting, I expanded my block list, adding my siblings and only leaving my younger cousin unblocked. He was the only one who'd reached out without piling on any guilt or criticism, and I appreciated his quiet support. The rest, though, they were done. A few days later, I talked with my therapist, telling her everything that had happened during the meeting. She listened and nodded, reassuring me that it was okay to protect myself from toxic relationships, even if those relationships were with family. I knew then that this wasn't just a phase. I was done letting them manipulate and control me. Predictably, my phone started buzzing again, this time with even angrier messages. My mom, my dad, and even my aunt were now furious, accusing me of abandoning the family. They piled on guilt and accusations, but this time I felt stronger, more certain. I didn't need their approval, and I wasn't going back. Finally, for the first time, I felt like I was standing up for myself without hesitation. And that, more than anything, felt like freedom. Update 3. Not long after I left the family discussion, I started hearing whispers about rumors spreading within the family. My phone buzzed with messages from friends asking what had happened. They'd heard stories about my disrespect and how I'd supposedly abandoned my family during the holiday. It was clear my family had taken things up a notch, rallying extended relatives and anyone else who would listen, painting me as the villain. One friend messaged me, genuinely confused. She'd known me for years and couldn't believe the things she was hearing. My mom and sister had apparently called some mutual acquaintances, telling them I'd disrespected the family by refusing to participate in family traditions, and that I'd humiliated my parents by leaving during Thanksgiving. My sister was especially vocal, making vague posts on social media about betrayal, selfish family members, and how some people just don't understand loyalty. It was almost comical how quickly they turned on me, but I knew their game. They wanted me to feel isolated, hoping that if enough people started questioning my actions, I'd cave and come running back. It didn't take long before I saw one of Jessica's posts. She'd posted a selfie with my mom, both looking heartbroken, and the caption read, "Some people never learn to value family until it's too late." The comments were full of sympathies from family friends and distant relatives, all sharing their own stories about family disloyalty and lost family ties. It was all so calculated, like they'd planned to make me look like the bad guy from the start. Then, to top it all off, I got a message from my cousin, the only one I'd kept in contact with. He'd heard the stories too, but this time, he sounded disappointed, saying he wished I could see things from their perspective. It stung to realize even he was starting to waver. He'd been my last ally in the family, and now even he was slipping away, weighed down by everyone else's version of events. The guilt tripping had spread through the family, and they all seemed convinced I was the one in the wrong, no matter what the real story was. The pressure only ramped up from there. My parents began sending me long emails, each one more dramatic than the last, saying they'd raised me to respect my elders and value family. My mom's messages were full of lines like, "This is hurting us more than you can imagine, and your actions have left us heartbroken." Every message seemed crafted to make me doubt myself, to make me question if maybe I really was in the wrong. But I'd come too far to fall for it this time. Around this point, friends of the family started reaching out, telling me they'd heard from my parents and asking if everything was okay. Some were genuinely concerned, others sounded more judgmental, clearly influenced by what they'd been told. I started avoiding these calls. The last thing I needed was to keep defending myself. To make matters worse, my mom found ways to tell her side of the story wherever she could. She even posted about it in a local community group on Facebook, in one of those vague posts that didn't mention me directly but was clearly about me. She shared how heartbreaking it was to be abandoned by family, with comments full of supportive messages about praying for her, and how some kids just don't appreciate what they have. The post spread, with people who didn't even know us commenting and offering advice, all based on her one-sided version of events. I thought about responding, about posting my own version of the story or setting the record straight publicly, but I knew that would only lead to more drama, and the last thing I wanted was a public back and forth with my family. I stayed silent, hoping that the lack of reaction would eventually force them to stop. Instead, their efforts only intensified, like they were determined to keep me in the wrong until I gave in. In the end, all the drama showed me who my real friends were. Some people I thought I could trust backed away, clearly influenced by the family narrative. Others stayed by my side, offering support and refusing to buy into the rumors. My friend group got smaller but stronger, and I found comfort in knowing who I could really count on. Therapy became a lifeline, helping me unravel the decades of manipulation and guilt tripping I'd grown up with. I'd spent my whole life being the family fixer, the one who kept the peace, no matter how much it cost me. My therapist helped me see why breaking away had felt so hard, why I'd stayed in the cycle for so long. For the first time, I started to understand that none of this was my fault, that setting boundaries didn't make me the selfish one. But despite everything, my family didn't let up. They wanted an apology, and they wanted it publicly. I kept getting messages from my mom, demanding that I clear the air and apologize for disrespecting the family. It was obvious they wouldn't be happy until I fell back in line and did exactly as they wanted. But I was done. I didn't owe them an apology for taking care of myself, and I wasn't going to sacrifice my peace just to make them comfortable. So I made a decision. I'd go completely no contact, except for my cousin. He'd been caught up in the family story too, but he was young and had been supportive in his own way. For the rest, though, I was finished. I blocked every contact and muted every thread, determined to finally put my well-being first. The silence was immediate, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt free. The weight of years of expectations and obligations had finally lifted, and I could focus on myself, my friends, and the future I wanted to build. Update 4. Once I cut ties with my family, my life suddenly felt quiet. No more guilt-laden calls, no more passive-aggressive texts, no more pressure to fix whatever drama my family had stirred up. At first, the silence was almost unsettling, like waiting for the other shoe to drop. But as the days passed, I realized I didn't miss it. The space around me felt different, open, even a little peaceful. I still went to therapy, processing everything that had happened. My therapist reassured me that it was normal to feel a mix of guilt and relief. I'd spent years as the fixer, so part of me felt responsible for the chaos I'd left behind. But each session helped me see that breaking free wasn't selfish, it was survival. With the weight of my family's constant demands off my shoulders, I started looking at my life differently. I decided to fill my days with things I genuinely enjoyed, things I hadn't had time for in years. I signed up for a cooking class, partly as a distraction and partly because I'd always wanted to get better at making something beyond the usual microwave meals. Each week, I found myself getting excited about trying new recipes, tasting new flavors, and meeting people who shared my interest. For the first time, I was doing something just for me. I also dusted off some old art supplies I'd tucked away years ago. Painting had always been a passion of mine, something I did to unwind. But over the years, it had been pushed aside, forgotten in the rush to manage family drama. Now, with free time on my hands, I began to paint again, losing myself in colors and shapes, rediscovering a side of me that had been buried. As I focused on myself, my friendships grew stronger. My friends noticed the change, less stress, more laughter, and a lightness they hadn't seen in me for a long time. I was finally present in my own life, free from the endless guilt trips and family obligations. Slowly, I began to expand my social circle, meeting new people at the cooking class and at art events. It was refreshing to build connections that didn't come with baggage or hidden expectations. My newfound independence even began to affect my work. Without constant distractions and the mental toll of family issues, I could finally focus. My productivity skyrocketed, and within a few months, my boss noticed the change. I got a promotion, and with it came a sense of pride and confidence I hadn't felt in years. It was like shedding an old layer of myself, stepping into a version of me that was unapologetically strong and free. The family silence finally broke when my cousin texted me one evening. He didn't apologize or guilt-trip me, just let me know the family was still furious but had accepted that I was sticking to my decision. It was a small update, but hearing it from him reassured me. Despite the anger and hurt my family felt, they were slowly starting to respect my boundary. At least, that's how it seemed. A week later, my sister Jessica sent a short message, something along the lines of, "I'm sorry for my part in all this. I hope we can talk one day." It felt rushed, like she was checking off an apology box rather than genuinely reaching out. I thought about how to respond and decided to keep it simple. I thanked her for the message, then reminded her that I still needed space. She didn't reply after that, and I didn't dwell on it. Then came an email from my mom. She poured out how the family was in pieces without me, describing how hard things had been since I'd left. She listed every reason why my leaving had hurt them, as if I needed to be reminded of the ripple effect my decision had caused. I read through her words, feeling the familiar tug of guilt, but this time I knew better. I could see the manipulation, the way each sentence was crafted to pull me back in. Instead of replying, I simply deleted the email. With Thanksgiving approaching, my friends invited me to join them for a holiday dinner. I hesitated at first, spending Thanksgiving without my family felt strange, but I knew this was the fresh start I needed. When the day arrived, we cooked together, shared stories, laughed without any underlying tension or expectation. It was the most relaxed Thanksgiving I'd ever had, surrounded by people who didn't judge or criticize. There were no hidden motives, no guilt trips, just genuine joy and friendship. That night, as I drove home, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. I'd spent so long weighed down by family obligations, so focused on fixing everyone else's problems, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to simply exist without strings attached. For the first time, I was in control of my own life, living on my terms. As I settled into bed, I thought back to the journey that had led me here. It hadn't been easy, and part of me knew there'd be moments when the guilt might creep back in. But now I understood that standing up for myself didn't make me a villain, no matter how much my family might try to convince me otherwise. The decision I'd made had changed everything, and for the first time in a long time, I was truly grateful. This was my life, and finally, it was mine to live. Update 5. Months passed in peace, and I'd all but put the family drama out of my mind when a letter arrived in my mailbox. It was handwritten, and the envelope was marked urgent. The address was from my parents, and it was strange to see their handwriting after so much time. I held the letter for a while, unsure if I even wanted to open it. My life had settled into a comfortable routine without their drama, and I wasn't eager to invite it back in. But the letter sat there on my counter, a quiet reminder that unfinished business still lingered. During my next therapy session, I brought it up, asking my therapist for advice. She suggested I read it, if only to see if they'd truly taken any responsibility or shown any willingness to change. The first few lines were from my mom, her handwriting shaky. She started by apologizing for everything that had happened over the past year. This wasn't like the texts or emails she'd sent before, full of guilt trips and subtle jabs. Instead, she acknowledged the manipulation, saying she hadn't realized how her actions had affected me over the years. She wrote that, looking back, she could see the patterns now and understood why I'd felt the need to walk away. She even admitted she'd pressured me to take on roles in the family that weren't mine to bear, always expecting me to fix things. It was as close to an honest apology as I'd ever seen from her. My dad's part followed, and it was shorter, more reserved, but it surprised me. He admitted that he'd ignored a lot of the issues because he thought it was easier to keep the peace by turning a blind eye. He wrote that he missed having me in his life, and he was even willing to attend therapy if it meant we could rebuild some sort of relationship. It was shocking to read. My dad had never been one to even mention therapy, let alone suggest going himself. Then there were notes from my brother and sister, tucked in at the end. My brother wrote that he was sorry if he'd added to the pressure, admitting that he'd always taken it for granted that I'd help, assuming I could handle it. My sister's note was short, more of a general apology for her behavior during the Thanksgiving debacle and the smear campaign that followed. I could tell she wasn't as invested, but even her message felt a little more genuine than anything I'd received from her before. Toward the end, they proposed a meeting as a family, with the added condition that we could all attend therapy together to work through the issues. They left it up to me, saying they'd respect whatever decision I made. For the first time, I felt they might actually mean it. I took a few days to think it over, then sat down to draft my reply. I kept it honest and to the point, telling them how much their actions had affected me and why I'd made the choices I had. I agreed to a meeting, but only on my terms. It would be in a neutral setting, mediated by a therapist. I made it clear that if we were going to move forward, my boundaries had to be respected with no excuses or dismissals of my feelings. I wouldn't settle for a repeat of past behavior. To my surprise, they agreed. They said they respected my need for structure and would follow my conditions, which was more than I'd ever expected. On the day of the meeting, I arrived at the therapist's office first, taking a few deep breaths to calm myself. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew I was ready to finally be heard. My family arrived shortly after, looking nervous as they took their seats in the circle. There was a tension in the room, but for once it didn't feel like they were preparing to gang up on me. It felt like they were actually here to listen. The therapist began, setting ground rules and reminding everyone that the goal was to understand each other's perspectives. My mom started, apologizing for the pressure she'd put on me. She explained that she'd been so focused on holding the family together that she hadn't considered the toll it was taking on me. For once, she didn't try to shift the blame or play the victim. She just listened as I told her how her words and actions had made me feel. My dad spoke next, admitting that he'd always brushed things under the rug, thinking it was the easiest way to avoid conflict. He said he regretted not stepping up sooner and promised to work on being more present in our family relationships. Hearing him acknowledge his role felt like a weight lifting, a part of the puzzle finally clicking into place. My brother shared his thoughts, admitting that he'd often relied on me to handle things because he'd assumed I was the strong one. He said he never considered that I might have limits too. My sister was the last to speak, and her apology was brief but direct. She admitted she'd been wrong to join the smear campaign, saying she now realized it had only made things worse. For the first time, there was no shouting, no interruptions, no dismissing of my feelings. Each of them took responsibility without deflecting or making excuses. I could see that this wasn't an attempt to get me back on their terms. They were genuinely trying to understand. When the session ended, I felt lighter. We weren't a perfect family, and we probably never would be. But for once, I felt seen and heard. I left the meeting with a sense of closure I hadn't known I needed. Going forward, I decided to keep contact limited, with regular family therapy sessions as a condition. This way, I could keep my peace while allowing a cautious rebuilding of our relationship. It wasn't the ending I'd expected, but it was the one I needed. I was finally free to live life on my terms, with boundaries firmly in place.